never imagined that something like this could happen to me. It's been 3 months since everything happened, and to this day I still can't sleep properly. I always wake up in the middle of the night thinking I'm going to smell that smoke smell again. It all started when I moved into an old building in the city center. You know those buildings from the 60s with faded tiles and a noisy elevator that looks like it's going to collapse at any moment? That's right, that's it. At the time I was in my final year of college and needed a cheap place close to the university. The apartment was small, but the rent fit my tight student budget. In the first few weeks everything was normal, apart from some strange neighbors and the caretaker who was always mumbling in the corridors. I spent most of my time studying and was almost never at home, so I didn't care much about these things. It was on a Wednesday that I realized that my keys were missing. I remember exactly because I had a test the next day and I spent the whole afternoon studying in the library. When I returned home at night, I went to look for the keys in my backpack and they weren't there. I looked through the entire backpack 3 times, all the bags, coats, every corner of the apartment, but nothing. The worst thing is that I was absolutely sure that I had put them in the pocket inside my backpack, as I always did. I ended up having to call a locksmith and spend money I didn't have to make new copies. I was irritated, but I thought maybe I had dropped it somewhere. 3 days later, when I opened the kitchen drawer to get a fork, there were my old keys. But they were different, all scratched, as if someone had sanded them, and there was a strange smell of smoke permeating them, the kind of smell that sticks to clothes after a fire. I decided to ask the janitor if someone had found my keys and given them to him, but he just shook his head negatively with that face of few friends. That's when I started to notice other strange things happening. Sometimes I was sure I had left the TV off before leaving, but when I came back it was on some random channel, or I would find objects in different places from where I had left them. Nothing very obvious, just small changes that made me wonder if I was becoming a little paranoid. I tried to ignore it. After all, it was exam time and the stress always made me more anxious. But then, on a Sunday night, I received the first message. It was from a number I didn't recognize with no profile photo. The message simply said, "I liked your blue blouse today. It matched the cup of coffee you had at 8:47. I was freezing. I was actually wearing a blue blouse that day and had eaten breakfast alone in the apartment." My hands shook as I stared at that message. How could anyone know such specific details about my routine? I blocked the number immediately, but the next day I received another message from a different number. "Why did you move the furniture last night? The room looked better the way it was before." The problem is that I hadn't changed anything. When I looked around the room, I noticed that my couch was a few inches moved from its original position, and the picture frames on the bookshelf were all facing the wall. I felt a chill down my spine and ran to lock all the windows, even though I lived on the 4th floor. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept looking at my bedroom door, waiting to hear some suspicious noise. The worst part wasn't just the fear of having someone watching me. It was the feeling that there was something very wrong going on in that building. Something that went beyond a simple stalker. That I decided to investigate the building's history further. I started by asking Olivia, a lady who lived on the 1st floor and who was always sitting in the lobby gossiping with everyone. At first, she was a little reluctant to talk, but after I offered her a coffee, her tongue loosened up. She told me that about 15 years ago there had been a fire in the building, but not in someone's apartment, it was in the basement. At the time, they discovered that a former resident had transformed the place into a kind of surveillance center. According to her, the guy was completely obsessed with the other residents. He had hidden cameras. He wrote down everything everyone did, the times they left, who they spoke to. When the residents found out, they held a meeting to expel him from the building. But before they could, the fire broke out. He died down there in the middle of all those notes and equipment. The most disturbing thing was when Olivia mentioned that after the incident, the basement was completely sealed. No one else had access to the place. They covered the entrance with concrete and even placed some heavy cabinets in front. She said that sometimes some residents swore they could smell smoke coming from there, especially at night, but everyone pretended nothing was happening. As she spoke, I realized it was the exact same smell I had smelled on my keys. I asked if anyone had access to the old plan of the building, because I wanted to better understand what this basement was like. Olivia turned pale and said it was better for me not to mess with these things. There are things that are better left alone, girl. Especially in this building. Even with Olivia's warning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That same night, after everyone went to sleep, I took my flashlight and went downstairs. I wanted to at least see where that basement entrance was that they talked about so much. The caretaker kept the tools in a somewhat hidden area near the garage, and that's where I found them. Behind some dusty cabinets, you could see a wall that was a bit different from the others with a lighter shade of concrete. When I brought the flashlight closer, I noticed that it had some strange marks on it, as if someone had scratched it. The scary thing is that some of them looked recent. I placed my hand against the wall and it was hot, much hotter than normal, and it had that same smoky smell, stronger this time, mixed with something I couldn't identify. That's when my cell phone vibrated in my pocket and I almost died of my heart. It was another message from an unknown number. Since you're so curious about the basement, why don't you try to find the other entrance? There's more than one way to get down here. My blood ran cold. The message had just arrived, which meant whoever it was watching me at that very moment. I turned the flashlight in all directions, but I didn't see anyone. The worst part was that I started to hear a muffled noise coming from behind the wall, as if someone was dragging something inside. The sound became louder and louder, along with a strange hissing sound that resembled breathing. I didn't think twice. I ran out of there as fast as I could, up the stairs back to my apartment. I spent the whole night awake, sitting in bed with my back against the wall, staring at the door. The worst part wasn't just the fear, it was the feeling that there was something very wrong happening, something that went beyond logic. Around 3 in the morning, I started to smell a smell of smoke coming from the air conditioning intake. It wasn't a normal smoke. There was something different about it, a slightly metallic, sickening smell. And along with the smell came that same dragging sound that I had heard downstairs, only now it seemed to be coming from within the walls of my own room. The sound came and went, as if something was moving through the building's ventilation ducts. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that tiredness was making me hear things, but then my cell phone started vibrating nonstop. There were dozens of messages arriving at the same time, all from different numbers, but with the same pattern. Each message described a specific moment in my day, with details that only someone who was watching me 24 hours a day could know. The exact time I brushed my teeth, the words I mumbled to myself while studying, even the nightmares I had at night, it was all there. The last message was different from the others. You are not the first to try to discover the truth about the basement, but you may be the last. Along with the message came a photo that made my stomach turn. It was an old image of the basement, before the fire, with walls covered in photos and notes about all the residents. And in the corner of the photo, partially burned, you could see a plan of the building showing something that no one else knew. There was an old network of tunnels connecting all the apartments to the basement. It was as if all the pieces of the puzzle suddenly fell into place. The changing location of objects, the smell of smoke, the noises in the walls. There was someone or something using these old tunnels to move around the entire building. I looked around my room in a panic, trying to identify where there might be an entrance. That's when I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. Near the baseboard, partially hidden by the wardrobe, there was a gap in the wall. With my hands shaking, I pushed the furniture a few centimeters and illuminated the area with my cell phone's flashlight. There it was, a small metal door, no bigger than a shoebox, covered in years of paint and dust. But the most disturbing thing was the fresh fingerprints in the dust, as if someone had recently opened it. At that moment, all the lights in my apartment started flickering, and the smell of smoke became unbearable. My cell phone vibrated once again. Now that you found it, how about a visit? I'm waiting for you down here. I have 15 years of stories to tell. The message was from a number that began with an old area code that hadn't been used in years. In a panic, I started throwing some clothes into a backpack, deciding to get out of there immediately. But when I tried to open the apartment door, the key wouldn't turn. I tried several times with all my might until I realized it wasn't the key that was locked. There was something blocking the door from the outside. and the sound of scraping on the walls was getting closer and closer, coming towards my room. I ran to the bathroom and locked the door, trying to call the police, but there was no signal. The sound of dragging now seemed to be coming from all sides, as if several things were moving within the walls at once. The bathroom mirror started to fog up on its own, even without the shower running, and when I ran my hand over it to clean it, I saw something that made me lose my breath. There was a message appearing on the fogged surface, as if someone was writing on the other side. Why so scared? I just wanted company. 15 years is a long time alone down here. The words were formed slowly, letter by letter. The smell of smoke was so strong that I started coughing, my eyes burning. That's when I heard a metallic noise coming from the corner of the bathroom. The sink drain cover started moving on its own. I ran out of the bathroom and went back to the bedroom, but stopped in shock at the door. The small entrance that I had found near the baseboard was now completely open, and I could hear a sound coming from inside, like the hiss of an old cassette tape mixed with labored breathing. My cell phone went back to working for a moment, just long enough to receive one last message. You have two options now. You can try to run away and I will continue watching you, as I have done with everyone else for the last 15 years. Or you can come know my collection. I have all the keys that have ever disappeared from this building, all the photos I've ever taken, all the stories that no one else remembers. Don't you want to know the truth about this place? The worst thing is, for a moment I almost considered it. Curiosity almost spoke louder than fear. Almost. In that moment of hesitation, I heard footsteps in the building's hallway and excited voices. Other residents had woken up to the smell of smoke and noises. Someone started knocking on my door asking if everything was okay. That's when I noticed the small entrance near the baseboard began to slowly close, as if something was pulling on the other side. The smell of smoke began to subside and the lights stopped flickering. I ran to the apartment door and now it opened normally. Whatever was blocking it was gone. I left there shaking, still holding my half-packed backpack, and found several neighbors in the hallway, all confused and scared. Some talked about having received strange messages too. Others swore they heard noises in the walls. I moved in the next morning. I didn't even go back to get the rest of my things. I asked a friend to do it for me. She said that when she went there, everything was normal, as if nothing had happened. The small entrance I found was completely gone, covered by a smooth wall without a single mark. The messages on my cell phone also disappeared, including the old photo of the basement. For weeks I wondered if I had imagined everything, if the stress of the exams hadn't made me hallucinate. Then last week, almost 3 months after moving in, I received a text from an unknown number. I miss you. The new resident isn't that interesting to watch. I blocked the number immediately and never opened any messages from an unknown number again. I also never lived in old buildings again. There are nights when I still wake up scared, thinking I smell smoke or hear that scratching sound on the walls. And sometimes, when a car passes by with the radio failing, that hiss reminds me of the noise that came from the baseboard entrance, and I ask myself, what if I had gotten in? What was really down there in the basement? I don't think I'll ever know. And honestly, it's better this way.
I never imagined that a simple trip to the park near my house could turn into this nightmare that hasn't let me sleep for weeks. It was an ordinary Wednesday. I had left work early and decided to go for a walk to clear my head, as the weather was pleasant. Parque dos Flores has always been a quiet place here in the neighborhood, frequented mostly by local residents. While walking along the main trail, I noticed something on the wooden bench near the playground, a black moleskine notebook, a little worn around the edges. There was nothing written on the cover, and it seemed to have been forgotten there recently. As I didn't see anyone around who could be the owner, I decided to take a look inside to see if I could find any identification. As soon as I opened the notebook, my stomach went cold. The pages were full of handwritten notes, in small, well-designed handwriting, organized as if they were diary entries. But it wasn't just any diary, it was detailed descriptions of people I knew in the neighborhood. Right on the first page I recognized the name of Dona Maria from the bakery, along with extremely personal information about her routine, her fears, and even thoughts that she would never share with anyone. It had details about conversations she had alone at home, intimate moments with her husband, and even the content of private calls she made crying to her daughter who lives in another state. I started quickly leafing through and found more familiar names: Carlos from the newsstand, Anna from the grocery store, Mr. Jorge from 502. All with equally disturbing descriptions of moments that no one but themselves could know. My hands started to shake as I turned the pages. It didn't make any sense. How could anyone know so many details about these people's lives? It wasn't gossip or things that you could discover by observing from afar. It was extremely private information, thoughts and secrets that could only be in each of their heads. I felt extremely uncomfortable, like I was invading the privacy of all my neighbors at the same time. The worst thing is that I knew that the information was true. Some of the facts described there were things that I had seen or heard about, but mixed with details that it would be impossible for any outsider to know. I decided I wanted nothing more to do with that sinister notebook. I quickly closed it and threw it in a trash can in the park, practically running home after that. I tried to distract myself for the rest of the day, but I couldn't stop thinking about those pages and how someone was clearly stalking and spying on everyone in the neighborhood. I took a long shower to try to relax and went to sleep early, wanting to forget the whole story. But when I woke up the next morning and opened my bedroom door, I felt my heart stop. There was the same black notebook on the living room table, exactly as I had found in the park. I ran there shaking, and yes, it was the same. I even recognized a small coffee stain on the back cover that I had noticed before. At that moment, I went into complete panic. Checking the door lock and windows, everything was locked exactly as I left it the night before. No one could have entered my apartment. How had that notebook gotten there? I started to sweat coldly, my breathing became heavy and I couldn't think straight. I stood there for a good few minutes just looking at him from afar, as if he was going to explode at any moment. I ended up working up the courage and approaching it slowly. Maybe there was some rational explanation for it all, maybe it was just a coincidence and this was another similar notebook. But when I opened it, it was exactly the same one I had thrown away, with the same disturbing notes. With my hand shaking, I started flipping through more pages, coming to parts one hadn't read before. It was then that my blood ran cold. There was my name, written in the same neat handwriting. Unlike the other entries that described past events, my page talked about things that hadn't happened yet. It said that today I would leave work early because of a severe headache, that I would have a bad argument with my boss and end up quitting on impulse. It even described the exact thoughts that would go through my head during the fight. I threw the notebook away and threw myself on the couch, trying to breathe. This couldn't be real. I must be going crazy or having some kind of nervous breakdown. I spent the whole morning locked in the house, calling work. I couldn't stop looking at that notebook left on the living room floor, but I also didn't have the courage to go near it again. Around noon, I decided I needed to do something. I couldn't just stand there forever. I took the notebook with a plastic bag, as if it were something contaminated, and went down to the building's garage. I threw it in the trunk of the car and drove to a vacant lot behind the train line. I set that thing on fire, watched it until it turned to ashes, and went home feeling a little more relieved, thinking I had finally gotten rid of that nightmare. But the feeling of relief was short-lived. When I got home and opened the door, I felt my legs weaken. The notebook was there again, intact, as if it had never been burned. This time it was open on my sofa, exactly on the page with my name. There was more text now, describing how I had tried to burn him and how I was feeling at this exact moment. It was as if someone or something was writing everything that was happening to me in real time. I threw myself on the living room floor, starting to hyperventilate. This couldn't be happening. There was no logical explanation. I must have been having a psychotic break, that was it. Desperate, I decided I needed to talk to someone mentioned in the notebook. I went down to Dona Maria's bakery, trying to control myself so I didn't look crazy. When I got there, she was alone behind the counter. I gathered courage and asked about the call she had made to her daughter, the one that was described in the notebook. Her face changed instantly, she turned pale. She confirmed that she had actually called her daughter crying on that specific day, but that she was alone at home and had never told anyone about it. She started asking me how I knew that, clearly scared. I didn't know what to say. I ran out of the bakery and went back to my apartment even more terrified. For the entire afternoon, I walked back and forth around the apartment, trying to find some logic in the situation. I even thought about going to the police, but what would I say? That he had found a magical notebook that knew all the neighborhood secrets and that refused to be destroyed? They were going to admit me right away. I tried throwing it out the window, chopping it into pieces, even flushing it down the toilet, but every time I came back to the living room, there it was again, with even more descriptions of my failed attempts to get rid of it. It was as if the notebook was mocking me. I locked myself in the room and spent hours lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, completely panicked. It was already getting dark when I finally found the courage to go back to the room. The notebook had moved again, now it was on the kitchen table. I noticed there was more text on my page. It described that I was about to discover something that would change everything. It said that in exactly 47 minutes, I would find information in the notebook that would make me understand its true purpose. My heart raced. I looked at the clock, 18:23. This meant that at 19:10 I would discover something important. I spent the next few minutes in agony, obsessively looking at the clock. When it hit 7:10 p.m., my hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold the notebook. I began frantically leafing through, looking for something different, some explanation. It was then that I found a page I hadn't seen before, almost at the end. It was a list of exact dates and times, with names next to them. I froze when I realized that these were specific moments in the deaths of several people. Some had already happened, others were yet to happen. I recognized some names of residents of the neighborhood who had recently passed away, with the dates matching perfectly. And there was my name too, with a date and time, exactly 15 minutes from now. 1925. I was paralyzed looking at that time, my mind spinning in a whirlwind of thoughts. It couldn't be real, I refused to believe it. But all the other predictions in the notebook had come true so far. I started to feel a sharp pain in my chest, my vision became blurry. The air felt increasingly heavy and difficult to breathe. I looked at the clock, 19:20. 5 minutes. I tried to get up to ask for help, call someone, do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if an invisible force was holding me there. 19:23. 2 minutes. The notebook began to vibrate in my hands, the pages turning quickly on their own. The pain in my chest became unbearable. The lights in the apartment started flickering, and I could hear a high-pitched ringing growing in my ears. 19:24. 1 minute. Sweat poured down my face as I struggled to breathe. I saw the second hand moving in slow motion. 30 seconds. 20 seconds. 10 seconds. I closed my eyes tightly, expecting the worst. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 19:25. And then, nothing. Absolutely nothing happened. The buzzing stopped, the lights returned to normal, the pain in my chest disappeared as if it had never been there. I opened my eyes, confused and still shaking. The notebook had disappeared from my hands. I looked all over the apartment, but he just disappeared, as soon as he appeared. That's been 2 weeks, and the notebook has never appeared again. At first I was relieved, thinking it was over, but now I realize that the feeling of fear never went away. Every time I wake up, I'm afraid I'll find him somewhere in the house. Whenever I see my neighbors, I can't stop thinking about all their secrets that I read about in those pages. And the worst thing is the doubt that never leaves my head. Why did the notebook appear precisely to me? Why did he disappear like that? And mainly, was that prediction of my death real, and was it just postponed, or was it all just a sick way of psychologically torturing me? I've never told this story to anyone until now. You're the first to know. I know it may sound crazy, and sometimes I even doubt whether all this really happened. But then I remember every detail, every sensation, the smell of those old pages, the impeccable handwriting describing things impossible to know. And I know it was real. Very real. I continue to live in the same apartment, carrying on with my life normally, but something has changed inside me. Now I know that there are things that cannot be explained, secrets that should not be revealed. And every night before going to sleep, I can't help but look at the living room table, just to make sure that that black notebook isn't there, waiting for me with more terrible predictions.
My name is Ava. I'm a single mother to Alice, my 4-year-old princess, and I want to share something disturbing that started happening to me about 3 weeks ago. I've been working as a freelance designer for a few years, which allows me to stay at home and take care of my daughter without relying on daycare. Since I separated from her father 2 years ago, I've been doing whatever I can to manage everything on my own, and I confess that it's not easy. We live in a small but cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood in Sao Paulo. One of those that still has a corner bakery and neighbors who know each other by name. I've always been a very skeptical and rational person, one of those who seek logical explanations for everything, but what I've been experiencing lately has made me question every certainty I had about reality. It all started on a particularly exhausting Monday, the kind where it seems like the universe conspires against you. Alice had woken up with a fever. I missed 2 important work deadlines, and I even had to deal with a leak that appeared on the bedroom wall. When I finally managed to put my daughter to sleep and sat on the couch to try to relax a little, it was exactly midnight. I remember because I had just looked at the time on the kitchen clock while getting a glass of water. It was then that my cell phone rang for the first time. On the screen, just an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't answer a call at that hour, but I was waiting to hear back from an important client and thought it might be work-related. When I answered, on the other end of the line there was just a dense silence, the kind that seems to have weight. I said hello a few times, but nothing. Exactly 2 minutes later, the call dropped. At the time, I didn't pay much attention. I thought it was a prank or a mistake, but little did I know that that call would just be the beginning of my nightmare. Over the next few days, the calls began to become more frequent and unpredictable. They weren't just at midnight anymore. They came at random times of the day, when I was at the grocery store, giving Alice a bath, preparing lunch, or even during online meetings with clients. The pattern was always the same. Unknown number, exactly 2 minutes of absolute silence, and then the call ended. I started to notice something even stranger. Even when I didn't answer, the call remained active for exactly 2 minutes before hanging up. I tried blocking the number several times, but the calls always came back from different numbers. The most disturbing thing was that I started to feel a presence on the other end of the line. It wasn't an empty silence, you know? It was as if someone was there, breathing softly, watching me through the phone. That started to affect my psychology in a way that I couldn't explain. A week after the calls started, I was already at my limit. I couldn't sleep properly anymore. I was startled every time the phone rang, and Alice started to realize that something was wrong. She had always been very sensitive to my emotional state. One Thursday afternoon, after receiving 3 calls in a row during an important work call, I decided it was time to take action. I waited for the next silent call to end and, with my hands shaking, I returned the call to that number. My heart almost stopped when, after 2 rings, a female voice answered. "Hello? Please stop calling me," said the woman, in a clearly disturbed tone. I didn't react for a few seconds, until I managed to respond. "What do you mean? You're the one who's been calling me for days." What she said next made my blood run cold. "No, you've been calling me every day, always in silence, for exactly 2 minutes. I have prints of all the calls." I instantly froze from head to toe. The whole situation seemed increasingly surreal. The woman began to tell me, with a choked voice, that she was also a single mother, worked from home, and had been receiving the same silent calls as me. As she spoke, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The times of the calls she reported receiving were exactly the same times my phone was ringing. But how would this be possible? We couldn't both be calling and receiving calls from each other at the same time. I exchanged information with her and discovered that her name was Charlotte. She lived in Belmont and had a 5-year-old daughter. The scariest thing was that her routine was practically identical to mine, from the time she put her daughter to bed to her freelance work. After this disturbing conversation with Charlotte, things started to get even stranger. That same night, while giving Alice a bath, she suddenly asked, "Mommy, who is that girl who looks like me on your cell phone?" I felt my stomach sink. I had never shown her any photos, much less mentioned my conversation with Charlotte. When I questioned her, she said that sometimes she saw a girl who looked like her reflected on my cell phone screen, even when it was turned off. I tried to stay calm and pretend everything was fine, but inside I was panicking. That night, I locked my bedroom door 3 times and put my cell phone in a drawer, but I could still hear a low buzzing sound coming from it, as if it were constantly active. After another bad night's sleep, I woke up determined to investigate the whole situation further. I contacted my telephone operator and discovered something that left me even more disturbed. According to their records, I had not received or made any calls at those times. It was as if the calls had never existed. Desperate, I tried calling Charlotte's number again, but now I only got an automatic message saying that the number didn't exist. I began to question my own sanity. Was I imagining all of this? But no, the silent calls continued, and now I could have sworn I heard a child laughing softly during those 2 minutes of silence. The sound was so similar to Alice's laugh that sometimes I would run to her room just to make sure she was okay. That's when I started to notice other disturbing coincidences. Every time I got a call, little things in the house seemed out of place. The drawing that Alice had made at school appeared upside down on the refrigerator. The toys that I was sure I had saved were scattered around the room, and the photo of us on the coffee table always appeared face down. One specific morning, I found a new drawing pinned to the refrigerator. It seemed to have been made by Alice, with the same childish style as hers, but it showed two identical girls playing with two cell phones. When I asked if she had made that drawing, Alice looked confused and said no. At that moment, my cell phone rang again, and I could have sworn that I saw, in the reflection of the screen, two identical girls watching me. That same day, around 3 in the afternoon, something happened that made me realize that the situation had gotten completely out of control. I was in my makeshift office in the living room, trying to focus on an urgent project, when Alice came running from the kitchen, looking scared. "Mommy, there's another mommy in the kitchen," she said, grabbing my leg. My heart raced instantly. I ran there, holding Alice on my lap, but there was no one there. However, on the kitchen table, I found a still steaming cup of coffee, exactly like my favorite cup, the one I had just used and which I knew I had left in the sink, dirty. When I looked at the sink, there was my cup, still dirty. Two identical cups, one on the table and one in the sink. It was then that my cell phone started ringing, but this time the sound was coming from two different places. My pocket and somewhere inside the kitchen. With shaking hands, I picked up my cell phone and saw the unknown number on the screen. But the other ring continued, echoing through the kitchen. I followed the sound until I discovered it was coming from inside the cabinet under the sink. When I opened the closet door, the sound stopped abruptly, and inside I found another cell phone. Exactly the same as mine, same model, same cover, even the small scratch in the upper right corner. The only difference was that, on the screen of that other cell phone, there was a call in progress coming from my number. I dropped the phone on the floor in shock, and at that exact moment, I heard a childish voice coming from the hallway calling, "Mommy?" It was Alice's voice, but my daughter was still on my lap, clinging to me, in complete silence. At that moment, I did the only thing I could think of. I picked Alice up and ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. My cell phone kept ringing off the hook, and now I could clearly hear the other phone ringing somewhere in the apartment, like a distorted echo. Alice started to cry, but it wasn't a normal scared child's cry. It was like she was feeling something I couldn't see. "She wants to play with me, Mommy," she sobbed, pointing to the wardrobe mirror. When I looked at the reflection, for a split second, I saw something that made me lose my breath. In the mirror, it wasn't me holding Alice, it was Charlotte. And the girl on her lap wasn't my daughter, it was another child, identical to Alice, but with a blank, almost mechanical expression. Desperately, I tried to call my mother, the police, anyone, but my cell phone now just showed an error message every time I tried to make a call. The other phone, the one I found in the kitchen, started ringing louder and louder, and the sound seemed to be coming from everywhere in the apartment at once. Alice clung even tighter to me and whispered something that made my heart stop. "Mommy, why are there two of me outside?" Through the crack under the bedroom door, I began to see shadows moving in the hallway, as if someone or something was walking back and forth. The sound of the footsteps was the same as Alice when she runs around the house, but there was something wrong, as if they were footsteps in reverse, with an unnatural cadence that made my stomach turn. I forced myself to stay calm, even though I felt like I was about to have a panic attack. I needed to protect my daughter, I needed to do something. That's when I noticed that phone calls always lasted exactly 2 minutes. Maybe there was some pattern, some logic I could use. I picked up my cell phone and started counting the seconds between one call and another. There were always 7-minute breaks. 7 minutes and 2 simultaneous calls. I looked at the clock. There were 4 minutes left until the next call. At that moment, I heard Charlotte's voice coming from the living room, singing the same song that I always sang to Alice to sleep. The sound of footsteps in the hallway grew louder, and now I could hear children's laughter echoing throughout the apartment. I hugged Alice tightly and tried to think of a solution. It was then that I remembered something crucial. On the day it all started, I had answered the first call at exactly midnight, looking at the kitchen clock. That clock had been broken for weeks, always 2 minutes late every day. Could it be? Could this delay have created some kind of time distortion? The coincidences were impossible to ignore. 2 single mothers, 2 daughters, 2 minutes, 2 phones. It was as if, because of those 2 minutes of difference, 2 realities had overlapped, mixing more and more with each new connection. As I tried to process this realization, I heard a key turning in the bedroom door lock, but I was absolutely certain that the only key was with me, in my pocket. On impulse, I put Alice in the closet and whispered to her to stay quiet. When the bedroom door began to slowly open, I could feel my heart beating so hard it felt like it was going to explode. It was then that I saw it. On the other side was myself, or rather, Charlotte. Now I could clearly see how identical we were, as if we were the same person living in different dimensions. She also looked terrified, holding her daughter on her lap, a girl exactly like my Alice. Our cell phones started ringing simultaneously, and when we looked at the screens, there were no longer any unknown numbers. Each was receiving a call from the other. The moment our eyes met, all the lights in the apartment began to blink frantically. "We need to fix this," Charlotte said, her voice shaking. "With each call, our worlds are merging more. Our daughters, they are beginning to exist in both realities at the same time." As she spoke, I realized I could see right through her, as if she was both there and not there at the same time. The 2 girls stared at each other, as if they were hypnotized by each other. The air became heavy, electrified, and the buzzing that came from cell phones increased until it became almost unbearable. That's when Alice, my Alice, from the closet, shouted, "Mommy, the clock!" I looked at the digital clock on the bedside table. It was exactly 2 minutes until midnight. 2 minutes to complete 24 hours since it all started. In an almost instinctive movement, Charlotte and I approached the clock at the same time. "If this started because of the 2 minutes difference," she started to say, and I completed her thought. "We need to synchronize times again. It was our only chance." The 2 Alices had begun to sing together a song that neither of us had taught them, their voices blending in a way that made my entire body shiver. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath our feet, and through the bedroom window I could see that the sky had taken on an impossible color, as if 2 different nights were merging. It was 1 minute to midnight. Charlotte took her cell phone, I took mine. The girls continued singing, their voices becoming more and more distorted, as if they were on several different frequencies at the same time. Exactly when the clock struck midnight, we pressed the answer button at the same time. The sound that followed was deafening, a piercing noise, as if thousands of telephones were ringing simultaneously. The walls of the room seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting. I saw Charlotte and her daughter begin to become transparent, like a photograph fading. The 2 Alices stopped singing at the same moment, and absolute silence took over the environment. Then, in a sudden flash that blinded me for a few seconds, everything stopped. When I opened my eyes, I was alone in the room with my Alice, who was slowly coming out of the closet. My cell phone showed 002, and there was only 1 missed call on the screen, from a number I now recognized, my own number, but with a different last digit. It's been 3 weeks since that night, and things are back to normal, or at least to what seems like normal now. The calls stopped completely, and that other cell phone I found in the kitchen just disappeared. Alice doesn't talk about the other girl anymore, and sometimes I wonder if she even remembers what happened. But a few small things have changed. I now have two identical favorite cups, although I only remember buying one. Sometimes I find duplicate drawings of Alice on the refrigerator with small differences between them, and every now and then when I glance at the mirror, I get the impression that my reflection moves a second after me. Last week, I received a letter with no return address. Inside there was just a children's drawing. Two identical houses, side by side, with two identical families, separated by a dashed line. On the back, written in a child's handwriting, was the message. Now everyone has their own time. I decided to keep the letter in a box, along with the kitchen clock that I had kept off since that day. I never tried to contact Charlotte again. I think it's better that way. But every day at 0:02, I look at my phone and wonder if somewhere else at some other time, she is doing exactly the same thing. And when Alice asks me to sing before bed, sometimes I'm sure I hear very softly, like a distant echo, a second voice singing along with me.